I will first provide a short background, very brief history of what happened in this area, in these policy areas. At the beginning, we had extremely loose networks of administrators exchanging information, exchanging best practices, and this was gradually institutionalized in both the areas of asylum and external border control management. By institutionalized, I mean the creation of two dedicated EU agencies, first Frontex and later the European Asylum Support Office. The next step, and which was something that we actually critically assessed last year in the conference, was the passage from practical cooperation towards joint implementation. And actually this is more vividly portrayed through the operations at the so-called hotspots, so through the implementation of the hotspot approach to migration management, where actually we see that deployed experts work together with national administrative authorities at these border areas in the registration, identification and referral, and in Greece also processing of claims. So this has been a recent development. But today we are going to actually focus on another area that is linked with the revamping of both EASO and Frontex, so their 2.0 version, which has been completed in what concerns Frontex, which has been rebranded as the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, and the regulation was adopted in 2016. And in what concerns EASO, it is negotiations are still underway into its development in a European Union agency on asylum. We have a partial agreement on the basis of which I'm going to provide comments, but negotiations are for the moment blocked slightly, and this has to do with the issue that several elements in the EUAA regulation hinge upon the conclusions in some other instruments that have been negotiated, and you may have heard in the plenary about actually the amendments proposed to the Dublin regulation, Dublin 4. This has been the main stumbling block. But we still see some trends already from the partial agreement. And these are the emergence of monitoring and steering functions. So today we will not focus so much on the joint implementation patterns, but rather on the emerging monitoring and steering functions in both those agencies. Starting with the European Border and Coast Guard. So the first function that has steering potential is actually the adoption by the agency of a technical and operation strategy. So it is circumscribed, it is not an overall strategy, but a technical and operational strategy for European integrated border management. And on this basis, national strategies are to be adopted. Second, monitoring-like functions, and one is the liaison officers, so monitoring the management of the external borders through liaison officers of the agency in member states. So monitor is actually the word that is used in the regulation. And what is perhaps also going further in this direction is the so-called vulnerability assessment. So what is its content of this assessment? Actually, it is also circumscribed somewhat in assessing the capacity and readiness of member states to face upcoming challenges. And with this, we also have in mind disproportionate pressures, and consequently to identify also immediate consequences for the external borders and for the operation of Schengen as a whole. Our mind also goes to the 2015-2016 so-called labeled crisis situation, which led several member states to reintroduce internal border controls, and also to assess member state capacity to contribute to agency deployments. So what could be the results of the vulnerability assessment? First, we have a gradation of measures, one could say. First, we have recommendations to alleviate vulnerability. The second layer would be a binding decision endorsed by the management board of the agency prescribing measures. And the final layer, and that would be linked also with jeopardizing the functioning of the entire Schengen area, would be actually the more nuclear option of an implementing act by the Council prescribing measures which the member state has to implement, accept, including potential deployments. So this is from the side of Frontex 2.0. Now looking into EASO and its passage into an EU JHA. And I'm going to focus on two areas. Country of origin information is the first one, and the second is a monitoring-like function that will be introduced in the regulation. And I am juxtaposing actually the current state of affairs with the envisaged state of affairs. So the agency is already active in the area of country of origin information. It gathers and disseminates country of origin information. It manages practitioner networks, specialized practitioner networks, and it produces its own reports, a certain number of them. It doesn't have the capacity to comprehensively cover COI in general. For the moment, these are one of the tools that are available to national decision makers, but there is no specific follow-up. So national authorities take these into account, but they are not required to take these into account. They are one of the several sources that are at their disposal. So the 2016 Commission proposal actually changed this rather in a more radical way. Now it has been watered down, actually, this function in the partial agreement, we must note already from the outset. So the steering potential has been somewhat limited. But the idea was that there should be a common analysis, so a jointly agreed position on country of origin situation. And on this basis, the agency is actually to produce so-called guidance notes that will be endorsed by the management board. And member states should take this into account. So this is the difference, although the regulation clarifies without prejudice to their competence for deciding on individual applications. And this goes into the limits between actually the powers of the agency and the powers remaining in the hands of national member states. So the more robust function that has been taken out was actually some reporting obligations of member states that were in the Commission proposal, specific statistics. Also, it was mentioned that when they diverged from the common position in their decision making, they would have to report on that, but all this has been taken out already. So the second function, a monitoring-like function, has also been introduced in the 2016 proposal and retained in this partial agreement. So now we don't have anything like a monitoring-like function. So we have an annual report on the situation on asylum in the EU, but this, and it has been stressed also in the regulation, but also in the practice of the agency, its aim was not to monitor per se or to provide precise recommendations to member states. So this is something new, an explicitly monitoring function. This was also somewhat watered down. It is more clearly prescribed. So the monitoring, it used to pertain to the implementation of the common European asylum system, so the implementation of the policy, and now it is more akin to the vulnerability assessments included in Frontex 2.0, because they are to monitor the operational and technical application of SEAS with a particular also purpose, a view to assisting member states to enhance the efficiency of their asylum and reception systems. And we have also here a gradation of measures. So we have draft recommendations from the executive director on which the member state concerned can provide comments. Then on this basis, we have recommendations to be adopted by the management board, 2/3 majority. Then if the situation is not alleviated, we have the involvement of the Commission, which can also then issue its own recommendation, and again at a very final stage, the nuclear option of an implementing act by the Council prescribing measures including deployments. Again, this is where the negotiations stand to date. This has not been formally adopted. So going back to the challenge of independence and some of the points already raised by Ellen, so EU agencies as in-betweeners, and she already elaborated on this point, so I no longer need to linger on this, but just to affirm that this is also the situation in what concerns agencies in the area of freedom, security, and justice. So the composition of the management board is that each member state is represented, and we have 2 votes also for the Commission, and in the case of EASO, we have UNHCR as a non-voting member. And you will see in the regulations, also in the envisaged regulation, that they have far-reaching, also in terms of the scope of their tasks, far-reaching roles, and also pivotal roles in these steering and monitoring functions. Of course, it is natural that each member state wants to be represented. This, as also Ellen highlighted, is a result of an increasingly integrated administration, and also is reflective of the role that the agencies are called to take upon, which is also joint implementation. So implementation is still in the remit of the member states. So once the EU level is more actively engaged, it is normal that member states want to continue to have a say on that. And we have multiple layers also of accountability processes, creating a delicate balance. This is portrayed very well in the function of the executive director, who is to be independent in carrying out her tasks, but which also has to be accountable before there are several layers of accountability. So financial accountability, political accountability, judicial also modes of accountability, but is also accountable vis-a-vis the management board. So the management board has a dual role, not only co-creating to an extent decisions, but also being a forum of accountability for the executive director. So practically, what does this mean? First of all, both the joint implementation patterns and these new monitoring and steering functions can further impact asylum seekers and migrants' fundamental rights. And this is raised in a recent policy brief by ECRE, Agent of Protection. Then the second risk is that given also the differential of powers between member states, and also the fact that national interests in these areas can difficult understood as something singular, so we don't have a national interests, but we have divergent national interests, agencies risk being captured by strong regulators and used as proxies to control weaker ones. So these monitoring activities might risk being instrumentalized. And finally, regarding their solidarity potential, because also agencies can be understood as a vessel of operationalizing solidarity, this remains somewhat limited and circumscribed, because even in their new regulations and their new functions, solidarity is to a large extent emergency driven. So to respond to emergencies and to disproportionate pressures. So some final perspectives before we hand the floor to the experts from the agencies and civil societies. So we saw that the mandate expansion has not been coupled with a radical redesign of internal governance structures. What can we do? How can we answer? What answer could we have to this independence conundrum? So one would be further enhancing the role of external expertise and embedding it within agencies. There are already processes by which agencies collaborate with experts, for example, in training activities of the European Asylum Support Office. There is a reference group, so external experts made up by academics and civil societies that comment on the modules. So this could be further utilized and strengthened for bringing the example of a panel on independent experts on country of origin information, and this has been raised by ECRE. Also, there could be a strengthened role of expertise in these monitoring exercises and the vulnerability assessment. Another perspective is, could social accountability processes act as an effective counterbalance? And by social accountability processes, I mean being accountable not only towards the EU institutions and the member states, but also vis-a-vis civil society. So the issue is that we must further study and understand what exactly is going on with the current processes of collaboration to civil society, to what extent they can be conceptualized as accountability processes, and Chris will elaborate more on this. Both agencies have in their design a consultative forum, and specifically Frontex 2.0 also has the role of a fundamental rights officer and has instated an individual complaints mechanism. So to which extent can these mechanisms be effective not only for better protecting the fundamental rights of migrants and asylum seekers, but also of helping agencies enhance their independence vis-a-vis their other masters? So I have now set the scene, and I will hand over the floor to the experts.